What if the most feared soldiers of World War II weren't the paratroopers storming the beaches of Normandy, or the rangers cutting through hedgerows, but a unit so secret, so devastating, that almost no record of them exists? The year is 1943. The Allies are planning the largest amphibious invasion in history. Every detail, troop movements, artillery placements, reconnaissance, is scrutinized, documented, and archived. Yet buried beneath the official plans is a set of orders no one will speak of publicly for decades. A sealed directive, coded under a name few would ever know, lands on the desk of an OSS officer in Washington, D.C. It is not addressed to a general, a colonel, or a major. It is addressed to the liaison in charge of special units. The instructions are simple. Recruit men from a particular Native American community, the Comanche. The Comanche, known for their unmatched horse riding skills, acute senses, and unparalleled knowledge of terrain and weather, had already played a role in World War I and the early communications war in wwii. They had long been recognized as some of the best trackers in North America. But the mission now was far more than communication or tracking. The officer is instructed to seek the elders and selected warriors quietly, explaining little beyond the need for men who can move unseen, who can strike without warning, and who can read the environment as a weapon. The elders, aware of the inherent danger but also the opportunity to honor their ancestors, agree. They select the sharpest young warriors, the ones who grew up listening to the wind, reading tracks in sand and soil, and understanding the rhythm of storms. By nightfall, the first group of men arrives at a remote training facility in Oklahoma. There are no insignia, no official unit numbers, and no mention of their place in the larger Allied strategy. They are simply known as the Storm Unit. Their purpose: to turn traditional combat on its head, using the wind, the earth, and the enemy's fear as their most lethal weapons. The training begins immediately. Officers are instructed to observe and learn, but not to intervene. The Comanche warriors move in ways that seem impossible, slipping through forests without a sound, tracking movements through weather patterns, predicting enemy patrols before anyone else notices. The soldiers paired with them are astonished. One diary entry, later recovered in a declassified OSS file, reads, "They move like the wind itself, faster, quieter, more precise than any man I have known. They are not soldiers. They are a storm made flesh." Within weeks, the facility becomes a crucible. Only a fraction of the men remain by the end of the first month, but those who survive emerge sharper, faster, and more attuned to the environment than anyone could have imagined. The OSS officers, many of whom have trained alongside elite units, begin to realize they are witnessing something unprecedented. A weapon forged not just from physical skill, but from an ancient cultural understanding of nature, stealth, and fear itself. By the summer of 1944, these men will be inserted into France, ahead of the Allied invasion. Their task is not just reconnaissance. They are to become the invisible edge of the D-Day assault. But as the Allies make their final preparations for Normandy, the military quietly erases almost all records of the Storm Unit's existence. Only fragments remain, scattered across personal diaries, redacted reports, and whispered testimonies decades later. And yet, some German soldiers who encountered them would later describe the horrors in diaries that survived the war. Men, or something beyond men, moving with the speed of storms, striking from nowhere, and vanishing before anyone could understand what had happened. The Comanche Storm Unit, as the directive promised, would be a weapon the enemy could neither see nor predict. And for decades, the world would forget they ever existed. The men chosen for the Storm Unit were not ordinary soldiers. They were the sharpest young warriors from Comanche families, descendants of a people whose reputation for tracking, stealth, and battlefield cunning stretched across centuries. For over 300 years, the Comanche had dominated the southern plains, earning the name Lords of the Plains from early Spanish colonists. They were unmatched horsemen, expert marksmen, and masters of ambush and terrain. In 1943, the U.S. military recognized what many historians still overlook. The Comanche's skills could be weaponized in a modern war. But it wasn't just about physical prowess. The directive requested men with a unique cultural awareness, a spiritual attunement to nature, an instinctive understanding of the wind, the weather, and the landscape. These warriors could track unseen enemies by subtle disturbances in the ground, changes in wind patterns, or even the flight of birds. They could move silently through forests and hedgerows in ways that conventional soldiers could not replicate. Once selected, the men were transported to a hidden training site in rural Oklahoma, a facility set up by the OSS far from prying eyes. Here, Comanche warriors were paired with elite U.S. Rangers and Pathfinder units. The goal: fuse ancient tracking techniques with modern military tactics. The training was brutal, almost ritualistic. Soldiers were taught to move as one with the environment. They learned to read the wind and shadows, to predict enemy movements before they occurred, and to use the terrain to create fear. Instructors documented their astonishment. Men disappearing into storms, only to reappear behind the training line, having taken hours to traverse paths thought impossible. One officer wrote, "I have never seen soldiers move like this. They are invisible, untouchable. It is as if the land itself fights with them." Each day, the training intensified. They ran through rain, wind, and lightning, practicing silent approaches, shadow maneuvers, and ambush tactics that would later become the foundation of their operational strategy in Normandy. They mapped entire areas of the training ground without ever leaving footprints, creating pathways that only they could navigate. The men were not only trained in physical warfare, but also psychological techniques. They practiced sowing confusion among mock enemy units, using illusions, sound, and shadows to make small teams seem like massive forces. One training exercise involved a single Comanche warrior, making 50 Allied soldiers believe they were surrounded. By the end of the month, only 31 of the original 92 recruits remained. These were no longer just soldiers. They were the storm unit. Their instructors noted a transformation beyond physical capability. The men moved with a calm intensity, silent confidence, and an almost otherworldly awareness. Some reports describe them reading the weather like a map, predicting enemy patrols based solely on cloud formations and wind direction. The unit's cultural cohesion was also key. The warriors shared a deep connection to their heritage, with rituals and teachings that bound them together. This bond, combined with their specialized training, created a team capable of operating independently in hostile environments with minimal oversight. As the men prepared for deployment to Europe, they were briefed on a single, chilling directive. You are invisible. You are a storm. You will not be recorded. You will not exist in history. By June 1944, these men, silent, lethal, and almost mythic in their abilities, would be among the first Americans moving through the hedgerows of Normandy. Their enemies would know nothing of them, and official Allied records would never fully acknowledge their existence. Even among the highest-ranking officers, the storm unit was a whisper, a ghost. Yet their impact would ripple across the battlefield in ways no conventional regiment could. And for the Comanche men themselves, this mission was not just a fight against a foreign enemy. It was a test of ancestral skill, endurance, and survival, under conditions their forefathers could have scarcely imagined. By the spring of 1944, the Storm Unit was no ordinary military formation. These men were warriors forged from centuries of Comanche tradition, now fused with the deadly precision of modern military doctrine. The training had already claimed lives. Over 60 recruits had dropped out or been injured, but those who remained had become something extraordinary. A force that could move unseen, strike without warning, and vanish into the wind. The training facility in Oklahoma was remote for a reason. Isolated from prying eyes, the OSS could test extreme methods that would never be allowed in conventional units. The Storm Unit's instructors, both Comanche elders and American officers, introduced exercises designed to merge instinct, culture, and military science. Soldiers were taught to anticipate the enemy, not through reconnaissance reports or maps, but through subtle environmental cues. The sound of a snapping twig, the flight of birds, even the shift of the wind across a field. Each day began before dawn. The warriors ran miles across uneven terrain, often in torrential rain, their feet leaving almost no trace. By mid-morning, they would practice infiltration exercises, moving silently through dense forests, sometimes while carrying heavy equipment, and striking at mock targets with rifles, knives, or improvised traps. Observers were astonished. One report notes a single operative navigating a 10-mile course through the forest without being detected by 30 guards. But the physical training was only part of the program. Psychological conditioning was equally rigorous. The men were taught to manipulate fear, using misdirection, noise, and shadow to create illusions that would confuse and terrify enemies. One exercise involved a lone soldier convincing an entire squad that they were surrounded by dozens of attackers, simply by moving silently and using sound strategically. The effect was uncanny. Officers later admitted these techniques would later terrorize German forces in Normandy. The unit also learned weather-synchronized tactics. Storms, wind shifts, fog, and rain were not obstacles. They were weapons. Training included exercises where men would time infiltration and attacks to coincide with changes in weather, maximizing the element of surprise and creating an almost supernatural effect on observers. One OSS report notes, "The unit seems to anticipate the storm, moving as if they are part of it, striking where the enemy least expects. This is no ordinary military exercise. This is nature made tactical." By the end of the first 6 weeks, the 31 remaining warriors were profoundly changed. They moved with extraordinary fluidity, almost imperceptible to the human eye. Their senses were heightened. They could detect an enemy at distances that defied ordinary logic. The Comanche warriors referred to it as listening to the wind speak, a phrase that would later terrify German soldiers who faced them in France. Cohesion was another crucial element. The men lived, trained, and ate together, sharing ancestral stories and ceremonies that reinforced trust and unity. They were taught that no man acted alone. In combat, every member was part of a larger organism, moving and striking as one. One officer's diary entry captured the essence of this transformation. "It is as if these men are a single entity, one mind, one will, one force of nature. We are witnessing a storm that walks, runs, and fights, and it does not forget." Their final preparation involved full-scale simulations of battlefield conditions they would face in Normandy. Hedgerows, fortified positions, machine gun nests, and artillery emplacements. By using stealth, psychological tactics, and weather manipulation, the unit completed missions faster and more efficiently than any other American training team. Every movement was calculated, every strike precise. The OSS concluded that these men were now ready for insertion into Europe. They were to be invisible soldiers, erased from official records and operating without any formal recognition. Their mission would not be conventional warfare. It would be surgical, terrifying, and unforgettable. As the men packed their gear for transport across the Atlantic, there was a quiet understanding among them. They were no longer just soldiers. They were an instrument of war, shaped by heritage, training, and secrecy. They were, in every sense of the word, a storm waiting to break. By June 1944, they would arrive in Normandy, ready to unleash chaos on German forces in a way that would never officially be documented, yet would leave whispers of Sturmgeister echoing across the hedgerows for decades to come. Before the beaches of Normandy ever felt the roar of Allied artillery, the Storm Unit was already in France. Months of brutal, secretive training had prepared them for one goal: move unseen, strike without warning, and sow chaos among German forces before the official invasion even began. These men were not just soldiers, they were instruments of fear, trained to manipulate terrain, weather, and human psychology as weapons. The insertion was carried out under extreme secrecy. By late May 1944, small groups of Storm Unit operatives were parachuted behind enemy lines or ferried via motorized boats under the cover of night. They carried only essential equipment: weapons, communication devices, and tools to manipulate the environment. Their mission was twofold: disrupt German reconnaissance and create confusion that would buy precious hours for the upcoming D-Day landings. French villagers would later whisper about strange events in the hedgerows. German patrols, often experienced soldiers, would vanish without a trace. Artillery crews abandoned positions, leaving guns unmanned. Local civilians reported hearing the wind in unusual patterns. A whisper that was not wind, some called it, just before explosions or sudden attacks. The Storm Unit's techniques turned these environmental cues into tactical tools. By moving in alignment with the wind and shadows, they could appear anywhere at any time, then disappear as quickly as they arrived. The men were experts in psychological manipulation. They used decoys, false tracks, and carefully timed noise to create the illusion of overwhelming numbers. One unit reportedly led a German patrol into a trap, where soldiers believed they were surrounded by dozens of attackers. When reinforcements arrived, the patrol had been wiped out silently, leaving no evidence of the method, only terror. Field reports from the German side, many discovered decades later in war diaries, describe encounters with what they called Sturmgeister, storm ghosts. Officers wrote of hearing voices in the wind, shadows moving faster than humanly possible, and enemy positions being attacked simultaneously from multiple directions without apparent coordination. One diary entry reads, "We fought men, yet it seemed as if the land itself turned against us. They vanished with the wind, leaving death behind but no trace of their presence." The Storm Unit also engaged in sabotage missions, targeting communication lines, radio towers, and ammunition depots. Unlike conventional units, they avoided large-scale firefights. Every action was precise, calculated, and designed to destabilize the German command. Officers at the highest levels of the Wehrmacht were left questioning whether they were being hunted by men or by some supernatural force. Despite their effectiveness, the Storm Unit remained entirely unrecorded in official Allied logs. Their reports were filed under false names, or not at all. The U.S. military had no intention of acknowledging these missions publicly. The men themselves were briefed repeatedly. "You do not exist. You are the wind, you are the storm. You leave nothing behind but the effect." By the end of May 1944, the Storm Unit had already inflicted damage and confusion that rivaled entire regiments. German soldiers faced attacks that seemed impossible, disappearing units, and the constant threat of an unseen enemy moving with the precision of nature itself. These early operations did more than just weaken defenses. They instilled fear, uncertainty, and paranoia. Commanders began to overestimate enemy strength, misallocate troops, and delay decisions. In effect, the Storm Unit had already begun winning the battle before D-Day even arrived. For the Comanche warriors, these missions were more than military objectives. They were a testament to ancestral knowledge, skill, and adaptability. The wind and terrain that had guided their people for centuries now became weapons against an enemy thousands of miles from their homeland. And as June approached, they prepared for their most challenging mission yet. The beaches, hedgerows, and fortified villages of Normandy, where their training, stealth, and psychological tactics would be tested on the largest scale of the war. The phantom wind was real, and it was about to break. The German forces would soon face not just an army, but a storm that moved with the precision of centuries of Comanche tradition and the backing of the most secretive military minds in Allied command. And yet, almost no record of this unit's actions would survive the war, leaving only whispers, fragmented diaries, and the faint traces of a force that the world would almost completely forget. June 6, 1944. The world knows this day as the beginning of the Allied invasion of Normandy. The beaches are chaos: Omaha, Utah, gold, Juneau, sword, thousands of soldiers landing under relentless fire. But while the main assaults raged on the shorelines, deeper inland, another battle unfolded, one almost invisible to history. This was the domain of the Comanche Storm Unit. Weeks of careful preparation and insertion had placed these men in key locations along the hedgerows, forests, and small villages that lined the path to the beaches. Unlike conventional units, they were not assigned objectives like holding a position or capturing a town. Their mission was far more strategic and psychological: disrupt, confuse, and terrify. German troops encountering them would face something that could not be measured by conventional military logic. From the first hours of D-Day, the Storm Unit struck with precision. Using their ancestral skills, they moved with the wind, exploiting every shadow, fog bank, and hedgerow to conceal their approach. Machine gun nests were sabotaged silently. Artillery crews vanished before they could fire, and supply lines were disrupted without a single conventional firefight. Reports recovered decades later described German soldiers abandoning their posts in terror, convinced that they were being attacked by forces beyond human comprehension. The unit's psychological warfare was as effective as their physical attacks. They used sound, shadows, and movement to simulate entire battalions. Small teams could make 50 German soldiers believe they were surrounded. One OSS report notes, "Patrols reported hearing voices on the wind, footsteps in empty fields, and enemy positions overrun without contact. It is as if the very land has turned against them." In one operation, a Storm Unit team infiltrated a fortified farmhouse near St. Lo. Using stealth, they eliminated sentries, blocked reinforcements, and created an illusion of a much larger force. By the time Allied infantry reached the site, the German defenders had either fled or been neutralized, entirely without the conventional battle that history books usually record. German diaries from the period, some discovered decades after the war, frequently reference Sturmgeister, storm ghosts. Officers wrote of unseen attackers striking with impossible coordination, vanishing into the wind, and leaving chaos in their wake. One entry states, "We face men who fight like storms. There is no predicting them, no resisting them. Fear is our constant companion." The Storm Unit did not operate in isolation. They coordinated with paratroopers, engineers, and local resistance groups, often acting as the unseen edge that cleared the way for larger units. Hedgerows and narrow roads were no longer barriers. They became channels for ambush, disorientation, and terror. Every movement was designed to delay, confuse, and weaken the enemy, allowing the beaches to be secured with fewer casualties among conventional Allied forces. Despite their decisive impact, the men were never recognized in official reports. Casualty figures were folded into generic ranger or infantry statistics. Mission logs were classified, names removed, and operations redacted. The U.S. military, even at the time, understood the power of secrecy. The storm unit's existence was not meant to be known, and any acknowledgement could compromise the unique combination of cultural knowledge and modern tactics that made them so effective. By nightfall, the German defenses along key inland positions were destabilized. Officers reported disorganization, soldiers fleeing, and entire machine gun positions unmanned. The storm unit's tactics had amplified the success of the amphibious landings exponentially. For the Comanche warriors, this was both triumph and burden. The weight of ancestral responsibility, coupled with the secrecy imposed by military command. As the sun set over Normandy, the battlefield told two stories. On the beaches, history recorded the courage of the thousands of soldiers storming the shore. Inland, among hedgerows and forests, another story unfolded, one almost entirely erased from official memory. The Comanche storm unit had arrived, struck with precision, and vanished like a storm on the wind. And while their actions were decisive, the world would not know their names, their faces, or the full measure of their terror for decades. For the men themselves, the experience was transformative. They had executed a mission unlike any conventional soldier. They had become invisible instruments of war, a storm that left chaos and fear in its wake. And yet, even among their own ranks, the psychological toll began to appear. The line between soldier, warrior, and myth was starting to blur. The Comanche storm unit had achieved the impossible. They had moved like shadows through the Normandy countryside, sabotaging German positions, striking fear into enemy hearts, and paving the way for the D-Day landings. Yet, while their enemies experienced terror, the men themselves carried a burden few could understand, a psychological cost that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. For decades, historians have focused on the heroics of paratroopers, rangers, and infantry, but the storm unit's story remained hidden. Unlike conventional soldiers, these men were trained to merge with the land, to move as a single organism with the wind, the trees, and the shadows. This level of immersion, while tactically brilliant, began to erode their sense of identity. They became hyper-aware of every movement, every sound, every subtle shift in the environment, and soon, the line between battlefield and reality began to blur. Medical and psychological reports from the period, though largely classified, hint at the strain. Officers observed men experiencing dissociation, moments when they seemed entirely detached from reality. Some would freeze mid-mission, their senses overstimulated by wind, birds, or distant noises. Others developed acute paranoia, convinced that enemy forces were omnipresent, even when alone. One surviving OSS psychologist noted, "They operate at a level of awareness no human mind is meant to sustain. Prolonged exposure to this form of combat alters perception permanently." Sleep deprivation, combined with the constant stress of moving undetected through enemy territory, compounded the problem. The men relied on intense concentration to survive. A single misstep could mean death. This hypervigilance became a kind of mental armor, but it came at a cost. Letters home, later recovered from family archives, reveal the men struggling with nightmares, unexplained guilt, and the difficulty of returning to ordinary life. The unit also faced moral dilemmas. Their missions often left German soldiers dead or incapacitated without direct confrontation. While these tactics minimized Allied casualties, they created situations that were morally ambiguous. Some members reported lingering feelings of unease and shame, a quiet conflict between duty and conscience. A diary recovered decades later contains the haunting line, "We kill in ways no man should understand. They call us invisible. I fear we are losing ourselves in the process." Even among themselves, the warriors struggled to reconcile their cultural identity with the mission imposed by the U.S. military. They were acting as instruments of war for a nation that had historically marginalized native peoples, yet their skills were being used to save countless lives on the battlefield. The tension between ancestral honor, personal morality, and military necessity created psychological strain that often manifested in silence, withdrawal, or subtle acts of rebellion. By mid-June, after weeks of operations ahead of and during the D-Day invasion, the cumulative effect was evident. A few members exhibited signs of severe stress reactions, including hallucinations of pursuing shadows, auditory distortions, and uncontrollable hyper-alertness. OSS medical staff, understanding the sensitivity of the situation, classified these incidents under vague labels like combat fatigue, ensuring that no official documentation could later compromise the unit's secret status. Yet even in the face of psychological strain, the Storm unit remained operational. Their cohesion, discipline, and reliance on ancestral knowledge kept them functional, but the human cost was undeniable. Many men would never fully reintegrate into civilian life. Some spoke of hearing the wind whisper their orders long after the war ended. Others avoided large gatherings, remaining hyper-vigilant to the subtle signs of movement around them. It was a paradox. Their success relied on absolute synchronization with the environment, yet that very synchronization eroded the boundaries between man and landscape. They had become living instruments of war, shaped as much by culture as by military training. And in doing so, they carried a burden no other unit had ever known, a burden hidden from records, reports, and public acknowledgement. By erasing their contributions from official history, the military inadvertently erased the validation of their sacrifice. The Storm unit had saved lives, disrupted enemy operations, and altered the course of Normandy, but their suffering remained invisible. It was, in every sense, a secret storm, raging silently in the minds of the men who had become one with the wind. The storm that had swept through Normandy was over, but its echoes were far from finished. While the Allies celebrated victory on the beaches and the hedgerows, a quieter, darker operation was unfolding behind the scenes, one that would ensure the Comanche Storm unit's existence remained almost entirely erased from history. From the top brass in the War Department to officers in the OSS, it became clear that the unit's success presented a dilemma. These men had operated outside conventional military doctrine, using methods that seemed almost supernatural in their effectiveness. Their ability to strike undetected, manipulate enemy perception, and vanish without leaving evidence was remarkable, but it was also a liability. Allies could not risk the techniques falling into the wrong hands. Moreover, the government had long maintained an uneasy relationship with Native American communities, and acknowledging the vital role of the Comanche might complicate political narratives. Immediately after Normandy, orders were issued to dismantle the Storm unit. Survivors were reassigned to conventional units, often under false names. Casualty reports were rewritten, death and injury statistics attributed to other regiments. Officers were explicitly warned not to discuss operations with outsiders. A memo from June 1944, later partially declassified, instructs, "All records pertaining to Storm Unit missions will be classified. Operatives are to be considered unrecorded and unacknowledged. No mention in operational reports. No debriefings for external personnel." Entire mission logs were shredded or filed under generic categories like Ranger Patrols or Reconnaissance Teams. Photographs were carefully retouched to remove any identifiable Storm Unit members. Even the OSS instructed surviving operatives to maintain strict silence, emphasizing that revealing their role could compromise national security and future operations. For the men themselves, this erasure was jarring. Their accomplishments, their sacrifices, and their lives in combat, all were removed from official memory. Some tried to leave notes in diaries or personal letters, but these were often intercepted, confiscated, or buried in classified files. One veteran later recounted in an oral history interview, "We saved lives that no one will ever acknowledge. We fought a war we're not allowed to speak about. It's like we never existed, except we remember." The U.S. military's rationale extended beyond secrecy. The methods pioneered by the Storm Unit, psychological manipulation, stealth-based sabotage, and environmental warfare, would later serve as templates for Cold War operations. By erasing the unit from history, the government ensured that these techniques could be refined and redeployed without scrutiny or moral questioning. Some OSS officers who had witnessed the unit's extraordinary abilities warned that the men themselves were at risk. Decades later, interviews with surviving veterans would reveal that the combination of intense training, battlefield trauma, and social erasure left many of the men isolated, struggling to reconcile their identity as warriors with their invisibility in history. For them, the silence was both a shield and a prison. Even German intelligence reports that survived the war contributed to the erasure. Commanders had described storm ghosts in field diaries, but post-war Allied archivists often dismissed these as exaggerations or folklore, never realizing they were referencing highly trained Comanche operatives. By 1947, the Storm Unit was officially dissolved. Files were sealed under multiple layers of classification, and surviving operatives were absorbed into conventional units or returned home, their wartime accomplishments invisible to the public. For decades, historians would study D-Day and the Normandy campaign, focusing on beach landings, paratroopers, and armored advances, unaware that a small unit of indigenous warriors had operated with surgical precision, leaving terror in their wake while remaining unrecorded. And yet, whispers persisted. Veterans occasionally shared stories with family members or close friends. Small fragments of diaries and declassified reports hinted at the extraordinary. The men who had become storms themselves carried memories of invisible battles and the knowledge that their contributions had been deliberately erased. The Storm Unit had succeeded in Normandy, but in doing so they became ghosts in the archives, shadows in the historical record, a secret weapon whose legacy would remain hidden, a storm no history book could fully capture. Even as the Comanche Storm Unit was quietly dissolved, their methods did not vanish. The U.S. military recognized that what these men had achieved, stealth, psychological warfare, environmental manipulation, was a blueprint for a new kind of combat. Though the world would never acknowledge them, the legacy of the Storm Unit quietly shaped covert operations for decades to come. By the late 1940s, as the Cold War began, the OSS had transformed into the CIA, and special operations forces were being developed for unconventional warfare. Manuals and operational guides, some derived directly from Storm Unit techniques, emphasized the use of terrain, weather, and psychological manipulation to disorient the enemy. Soldiers were trained to blend with their surroundings, infiltrate enemy positions silently, and create fear as a weapon, a direct echo of Comanche methods honed in Normandy. In Korea, small elite units experimented with tactics that mirrored the storm unit's training. Teams were taught to move with the environment, strike without warning, and vanish before detection. Reports from the period suggest that these units occasionally used indigenous knowledge from local tribes, a practice reminiscent of the way Comanche warriors had fused ancestral skills with modern technology in wwii. While these missions were classified, declassified documents hint at remarkable successes. Operations carried out without firing a single conventional shot, leaving enemy forces confused and demoralized. Vietnam would further demonstrate the storm doctrine in action. MACV-SOG, the Special Operations Group, trained teams to operate deep behind enemy lines, relying on stealth, tracking, and environmental awareness. They employed methods eerily similar to those developed by the storm unit: silent reconnaissance, psychological disruption, and guerrilla-style ambushes. One officer, in a declassified interview decades later, remarked, "We didn't call it the storm unit anymore. We didn't even know all the history. But the tactics were there. It's all about moving unseen, striking fear, and leaving no trace." Even within the U.S., the techniques were adapted for modern warfare. Black-budget programs experimented with acoustic weapons, subsonic sound, and night infiltration technologies, all designed to manipulate perception and create chaos before direct confrontation. The men who trained these programs often referenced Normandy and earlier OSS missions as inspiration, even if the Comanche warriors themselves remained uncredited. Yet for the original members of the storm unit, the legacy was bittersweet. Some were recruited into post-war intelligence or special operations roles, but most returned home, living as ghosts in their communities. They bore the scars of mental strain and the knowledge that their heroism would never be formally recognized. Diaries, oral histories, and scattered letters reveal a lingering tension, pride in their unmatched skill, and frustration at being erased from official memory. Historians who later pieced together fragments of storm unit operations were often astonished. Redacted OSS files, declassified CIA documents, and German accounts of storm ghosts painted a picture of a unit whose influence stretched far beyond Normandy. Yet because the men were never officially acknowledged, and because many operations remained classified, the broader public would remain unaware for decades. By the end of the Cold War, the storm doctrine had evolved into a cornerstone of U.S. Special Operations doctrine. Every elite unit trained to move undetected, create confusion, and strike psychologically owes a measure of its methodology to those Comanche warriors who moved like wind through Normandy. Their techniques became institutionalized, their impact undeniable, yet their names, faces, and personal stories remained almost entirely hidden from history. Even today, some military analysts suggest that the principles pioneered by the storm unit are still in use: covert insertions, psychological operations, and terrain-based infiltration exercises bear a striking resemblance to what a small band of Comanche warriors perfected 70 years ago. In a very real sense, the storm never ended. It merely moved into the shadows, waiting for the next battlefield. The question remains: if these methods were once classified and are still applied in Black Ops missions, could the legacy of the Comanche Storm Unit still be shaping modern warfare? The answer may be known only to a few, but the evidence is unmistakable. The storm they created in Normandy has never truly dissipated. Decades have passed since the beaches of Normandy bore witness to the greatest amphibious assault in history. Yet even now the story of the Comanche storm unit remains almost entirely absent from official records. They are ghosts, not just to the enemy they struck, but to the history books themselves. Surviving members returned home to lives of quiet invisibility. Their heroism went uncelebrated. Their deeds were classified, redacted, or buried under layers of bureaucracy. Some took up ordinary work. Others quietly joined early special operations programs. And a few became shadows among veterans' communities. But all carried memories of a mission that blurred the line between warrior and myth. For the Allies, the storm unit had been a decisive force. German reports describe unimaginable terror, soldiers disappearing in the fog, entire patrols incapacitated without confrontation, and a psychological paralysis that lingered even after physical defeat. Yet in official Allied accounts, there is little mention of small, specialized teams wreaking such havoc. The beaches of Normandy, the hedgerows, and the forests are filled with documented heroics, but the invisible edge, the storm that moved unseen, is almost entirely missing. Historians who later attempted to reconstruct the unit's operations faced obstacles at every turn. Files were classified, destroyed, or intentionally misfiled. Diaries and letters surfaced only sporadically, hinting at extraordinary feats that seemed impossible for men of their size and training. Fragments of German intelligence logs, OSS operational reports, and oral testimonies provide glimpses of what was truly happening. But connecting these dots is like chasing shadows. The erasure of the storm unit was deliberate. Military leadership understood that revealing the unit's methods and effectiveness could compromise future operations. The same techniques that made them almost supernatural in Normandy became foundational for Cold War and modern special operations. Yet this secrecy came at a cost. The men who executed the missions were denied recognition, and the full historical impact of their actions remains largely speculative. Even today, whispers persist among historians and military analysts. Some claim that training programs for elite units in the US, Europe, and Asia incorporate methods that can be traced directly to Comanche strategies. Stealth insertion, environmental awareness, psychological disruption, and using natural terrain as a weapon. The storm unit's influence is undeniable, but it exists in a shadowy lineage, rarely acknowledged and often obscured by classification and the passage of time. For the men themselves, the legacy is complicated. Pride in accomplishment mixes with frustration and sorrow. They performed extraordinary feats, saved countless lives, and altered the course of battles. Yet the world does not know their names. The wind still whispers their deeds, carried in oral histories, family stories, and the faint echoes of classified reports. Perhaps the most chilling truth is that the storm never truly ended. Its methods continue to influence warfare, quietly shaping modern operations, leaving the impression that something unseen, calculated, and terrifying remains always at work. The Comanche storm unit was more than a military unit. They were a force of nature, a living embodiment of centuries of skill, tradition, and cunning. And while most of the records are missing, the traces of their impact are undeniable for those who know where to look. History may have tried to forget them, but the storm remembers. It waits in the hedgerows, in the shadows, and in the whispers of those who survived it. And as long as warfare exists, the legacy of the Comanche storm unit continues to move, unseen, unstoppable, and unrecorded. The question remains, how many other stories, like theirs, have been erased? And what other storms are out there, waiting for the world to forget they ever existed?